So with that, welcome everyone. My name is Shelby Ward. I'm Director of Sustainable Tennessee with the Tennessee Environmental Council. The Tennessee Environmental Council envisions a Tennessee where both people and nature thrive in harmony. Now, before we get started, I wanted to make a land shout out. So the Tennessee Environmental Council works statewide, but I work out of a home office in East Tennessee. So I wanted to recognize the land, air, and waters of East Tennessee, and also the Cherokee peoples that have loved and cared from this place from time immemorial until this day. And I'm grateful for the land stewardship and care of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, the United Kiowa Band, and the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma that have cared for lands in this area for time immemorial. So with that, I'm so happy to welcome everyone here that can join us for our October Policy and Practice Space meeting, Unjust, Wastescapes. And I have a few housekeeping items before we hear from Dr. Padgett, our guest speaker. So everyone here in Zoom, please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're listening in from. And we will be using the Q&A function. So if you have any questions now or even during the presentation, please put them there. And after Dr. Padgett's presentation, we will field those questions. And then also about recordings, as we said, this is recorded and we will post it on our social media for use later. So for those of you that have just joined us in the Zoom room, welcome to the October Policy and Practice Space about unjust wastescapes and environmental justice. So with that, I'm handing our program over to our CEO, Jeff Berry, for a few more preliminary matters before we hear from Dr. Padgett. Okay, Jeff.
Thank you, Shelby. And I want to thank everybody who has joined us here in the viewing audience, whether you're watching the recorded one or right here live on our Zoom. Thanks for joining us. This is a really wonderful opportunity to learn. I'm excited to learn from Dr. Padgett, who's going to talk about a perspective that is new to me from communities that are nearby here in Nashville and throughout Middle Tennessee, from a perspective on the ground. And so how other communities are impacted by the trash that we throw out every day, right? That we could be recycling. So it's going to be a great presentation. It's an honor to have you here with us, Dr. Padgett, and I'm excited to hear about your presentation and learn something and learn how to make changes in my own life and my professional practice, as well as the CEO of Tennessee Environmental Council, that can honor and enhance what needs to be done to make our communities more just and to clean it up. And that's going to help everybody in improve lives for everybody, especially those that are being most harmed by these unjust practices. So what I want to do is invite you all to consider a very easy way, simple way, and a mindless way to support Tennessee Environmental Council in this ongoing work. We're doing webinars on a regular basis on topics like this across Tennessee. They're open to anybody to join and learn and get involved in the solutions. And so one of the campaigns we have to build support for this effort is to have everybody listening sign up, and not sign up, but earmark your Kroger rewards, your Kroger community rewards to the Tennessee Environmental Council. If you shop at Kroger and you have a rewards card, and I've been doing that for 2 decades now, and you enter your code in when you shop and you're about to pay for your groceries, well, if you go into your account, you can choose Tennessee Environmental Council as your nonprofit partner, and we would receive your community rewards points. It's no cash out of your pocket, but Kroger gives us a donation every quarter based on the number of points that are earmarked towards Tennessee Environmental Council. So rather than have you do that right now, what I want to ask you to do is if you're willing to do this, to earmark Tennessee Environmental Council as your recipient, to enter I'm in, just go to chat right now and just type in there I'm in, and we'll follow up with you later with instructions on how to do that. So thank you for that. And I appreciate you supporting Tennessee Environmental Council. We want to get 1,000 people, 1,000 of our participants that have earmarked Tennessee Environmental Council to receive your community rewards points. So thank you for that. I'll hand it back over to you, Shelby.
Okay. All right, thanks so much, Jeff. And with that, it's time for me to introduce our speaker. Our guest speaker is Dr. David Padgett. He is Associate Professor of Geography at Tennessee State University in Nashville. Dr. Padgett specializes in Geographic Information Systems, GIS, and environmental justice. He is also founder and chief consultant of GeoMental. Geomental provides geospatial technology and environmental consultation to public entities, private entities, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations. So Dr. Padgett has also earned degrees from the University of Florida and Western Kentucky University. Thank you for joining us here in the policy and practice space, Dr. Padgett.
Thank you. Thank you. So I guess I should share my screen here. And okay, and then it's the slideshow mode. And here we go. Okay, good evening. Whoops. Good evening. This is a presentation that covers the history of waste and environmental injustice in Middle Tennessee. And I'll be describing several case studies that I've been involved with, focusing upon policy and history. There is some technical information in there. Part of my background is in hydrogeology. And so I originally made this presentation for the National Association of Black Geoscientists. So there's some hydrogeology and geology in there. I won't bore you all too much with that. So a brief history of environmental injustice in Middle Tennessee, from urban renewal to toxic landfills to brownfields redevelopment to urban mining to green gentrification. All of these things either are happening or have happened in Nashville. So Nashville, Tennessee, known for country music, has had a really significant role in the brief history of the environmental justice movement. But from the standpoint of history, we cannot leave out the effects of certain land use changes and land use policies in the past. One of them, of course, was urban renewal, which essentially was a housing upgrade policy, or the policy essentially was to mitigate the unhealthy conditions under which people were living in cities all over the country, as there was an influx in cities all over the country of what we call rural to urban migrants, people who came from agricultural areas and moved into the cities to take advantage of secondary sector industrial and to some degree service sector jobs, as we became less and less and less of an agrarian economy. And so a lot of the homes that were in cities would be considered substandard. So for instance, my father, who is 85 years old, he was born and raised in the South, in the segregated South, and his house for a while did not have indoor plumbing until, a while later. They sometimes cooked with a wood stove. They sometimes did their laundry with on a fire, burning wood. And so those kind of conditions often led to the greater likelihood of diseases and infection, especially waterborne diseases. Of course, a lot of those diseases like polio and typhoid and others, we don't deal with at all. But back then, the unsafe, unhealthy housing conditions certainly allowed those diseases to take the lives of many babies. Infant mortality was much higher. And so this housing program was essentially an environmental health program. Let's get people out of these substandard houses and get them into public housing. And so a lot of people who are surprised to learn that at one time moving into the projects was a step up. But if you were in a house in the city with no electricity and no running water, no air conditioning, no heat, and someone tore your house down and moved you into public housing, that was physically a move up. But what about emotionally? What about psychologically? A lot of these people, sure, the homes were substandard, but there are people who could say, well, my grandmother was born in this room, and my father was born in that room. And so you had generations of African Americans, for the most part, living in these very humble homes, but they weren't born in the local hospital. They couldn't go to the local hospital and be born. A lot of people were born right at home, and so there's an emotional connection to that was lost. And in the communities, when you raise whole communities of people who perhaps had lived in those neighborhoods for generations, and now they're scattered all over the place in public housing, that can be quite disruptive in and of itself. Uh, there's a saying that the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. So certainly, urban renewal was not some kind of program that was literally meant to remove Black people, even though that's its nickname. Urban renewal is Black removal. Certainly, the downstream effects of the policy had long-term implications upon urban form, specifically the removal of African Americans into public housing created pockets of what we call concentrated poverty. And so if we look at Nashville, for instance, if you look at the area downtown from where the Capitol building is, all the way down to Second Avenue, all along that crescent around Capitol Hill, that was all an African American community called Black Bottom. But of course, it was all those homes were razed, and really there's not much left of that neighborhood now. So urban renewal is something that we have to discuss in terms of the environmental injustice history of any large city in the United States. But Nashville was it was especially impactful. And if you talk to people of a certain age in Nashville, they'll tell you they tore down my mama's house, and we had to move away from all my friends and family to someplace in Edge Hill, or maybe over to Preston Taylor. Okay. Another significant environmental issue of environmental injustice is the Interstate 40 case. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court as the community of North Nashville along the Jefferson Street corridor fought all the way to the Supreme Court to attempt to stop this interstate from being pushed through the heart of the Black community along Jefferson Street and environs. Thousands of businesses were lost, thousands of homes were lost, thousands of people were displaced again. And from an economic standpoint, the corridor really has not completely recovered from the impacts of Interstate 40. Another case of environmental injustice. And it wasn't just Nashville. This type of interstate highway construction through Black communities happened in South Florida, happened in Greensboro, North Carolina, Minneapolis, Minnesota. We can go on and on and on and on to many large cities in the United States that where these highways push through and completely change the environment of these communities, which gets me to a definition of terms. So traditionally, when we say the environment, and when I say we, just general people, oftentimes we're still at the point of the preservationist and conservationist movement that occurred in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century. That conservationist and preservationist movement resulted in the establishment of the national parks, the national forests, the Soil Conservation Service, and so on and so forth. And those policies were in response to the Industrial Revolution, where in this country specifically, people tried to mine every piece of gold, chop down every tree, slaughter every bison, until it got to the point that people said, wait, if we continue at this pace, there will be nothing left of the beauty of what we call North America, which, if you really think about it, is selfish in and of itself, because the preservation of the natural environment was not for the sake of the natural environment itself. The preservation was for us, so that we humans could enjoy the beauty. we weren't saving the trees and the soil because it had a right to exist. You know, if you read Aldo Leopold's Land Ethic, he really was written in 1949. So when Leopold wrote the Land Ethic, it was right in the middle of the post-World War II period. He was shouting in the dark. It wasn't until like the 1960s environmental movement that people finally, this is what Leopold was saying. So a lot of people, when we say environment, only define the environment in the form of trees and birds and water. But when we start to talk about a home or a neighborhood or even a place of work, and you start talking about words like environmental injustice, you're like, well, no, that's not part of the environment. You have to be out in the woods, trees to be part of the environment. But the environmental justice movement expands the definition of environment to include human beings and everywhere that we work, play, study, and live. And so, yes, a highway, even though this highway isn't plowing through a pristine field somewhere in Midwest or plowing through an old growth forest, the fact that this highway is plowing through people's homes and neighborhoods and churches and businesses is an environmental injustice just the same. So now we come to one of the environmental injustice cases that, and I'm a geographer, so that put Nashville on the map, so to speak, in terms of environmental justice or environmental racism, the Bordeaux landfill, right now, or Bardo for some locals. So a typical argument against environmental injustice is, well, we're in a capitalist society and capitalism produces winners and losers. And if you don't engage successfully in a capitalist system, of course, you're going to have to deal with the output or the negative externalities associated with that capitalist system, i.e., you might be more likely to live next to a landfill or a dump or a polluting facility, not because you're Black, but because a lot of Black people happen to be poor. And so in 1968, for instance, 68% of African-American families were in poverty, 68%. So that was the explanation. Well, you're poor. A lot of Black people are poor. So the argument was, well, if you had money, if you were rich, if you had an education, if you had done something with your life, you wouldn't be in this situation. But the Bordeaux landfill case blows that argument out of the water completely. Speaking of 1968 was the year that the Federal Housing Rights Act was passed in an attempt to get rid of redlining laws and other housing discrimination type of housing or discriminatory practices that were forced upon the Black community, and often, of course, relegated African Americans, no matter who they were, to the Black side of town. I'll reference my father again. So my grandmother was, for most of her life, a domestic, but she lived right across the street from teachers, right across the street from physicians, right down the street from lawyers in their neighborhood. So it didn't matter whether you were a lawyer, teacher, professor. If you were Black, you were relegated to one part of town. You were redlined out of every other part of the city until, of course, 1968. So beginning in 1968 and soon thereafter, those doctors, lawyers, professors, and physicians in Nashville moved from those areas of concentrated poverty to what at that time was a suburb of Nashville, to what we now know of as Bordeaux or Bardo. So these people were not poor. They were certainly not educated. However, not too long after they established the Bordeaux community, invested in their homes, guess where the landfill went? Right there next to them. And so the Bordeaux landfill is an exemplary case of where you can not say that this is about class. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the literature says that race, not class, but race is the main predictor of whether or not a person will live next to a landfill or a polluting site. So it's a little deeper than just saying, well, that's the cost of being poor, is that you deal with waste. This case really blows that argument completely out of the water. Now, fortunately, Bordeaux had that human capital, and they were able to organize. Now, it took 20 years, but they were able to organize and finally get this landfill shut down in the early 1990s. And that was with a community that had that could weaponize their talents and resources. So imagine if this had been a poor, low-income African-American community, chances are that landfill would still be out there fully operational, looking like it does on the left-hand side of that screen. Interestingly enough, also in 1973 was the Nashville Thermal Transfer Waste to Energy Facility. In 1973, as this New York Times article describes, this was cutting edge technology. I'm going to simplify it. You burn trash and produce electricity. This was cutting edge technology, waste to energy. Wow, this is the solution to our waste problems, right? Or so people thought. So at that time, half of Nashville's solid waste went to the Bordeaux landfill. The other half went to the thermal transfer facility. So we meaning Nashvillians, were basically taking care of all the trash that we produce. Now, the thermal plant sounds like a nice place. Look at the picture. Looks nice and clean, but the thermal plant, for those of you who actually went to it, was one of the nastiest places you could ever go. And it was right in the heart of downtown Nashville, right in the heart of the city, right there where 2nd Avenue is and all the honky tonks, and where all people used to come here when we had tourism before COVID. Right in the middle of all of that. And if you notice, there's a cloud. Unfortunately, the thermal plant did not vaporize the trash. Trash instead was burned, which produces byproducts such as smoke. So interestingly enough, the thermal plant was completed right around the same time that the Clean Air Act was established. Very interesting coincidence, because maybe the technology was not designed to be in compliance with the Clean Air Act, because there was no Clean Air Act. So the thermal plant was notoriously a violator of Clean Air Act regulations. There were days when I would fly into Nashville, and there's an approach by some of the planes into Nashville's airport that takes you right over downtown Nashville. And on a clear day, I would look down, not see a cloud in the sky, except this one great big white cloud right downtown. And I'm like, how could there be one cumulus cloud and not another cloud in sight? It was a thermal plant, as you could see. And so that air pollution wafted across the Cumberland River right into the Casey Homes, which is Nashville's largest public housing community, about 2,400 people. Of course, it's going through a transition right now, but 2,400 people, mostly women and children, and a significant percentage of those children suffer from asthma. In fact, that area has some of the highest pediatric asthma cases in Middle Tennessee, which just compounds the problems of living in that community to a degree. So you're already at somewhat of an economic disadvantage, and maybe the one way or the main way that a lot of Black people changed their circumstances was through education, right? Going from the 19th into the early 20th century, only 3% of African Americans were literate. 3%. We pushed that to over 90% in maybe 40 or 50 years, right? So you're already in a kind of tenuous situation in terms of, but you have hope that maybe my child can get an education. But guess what? Asthma is a leading cause of children missing school. So now this not only is a health problem, it's also an academic problem. And so that smoke, along with the fallout from the interstates, has plagued that community for literally decades. I wonder what's going to happen after the Envision Casey project gets finished. When we have some different people living over there, maybe we'll see some different policies. I don't know. Um, anyway, so one byproduct was air pollution. The second byproduct was ash. When you burn anything, you burn charcoal, it leaves ash, right? The question is, well, what are you going to do with all of this ash? And it's really difficult to appreciate how big thermal was. Uh, I used to take students to the thermal plant, and they used to think that that was all the trash for a year in Nashville. No, it was half the trash. All those trucks rolling in, out, in, out. That was half the trash for one day in Nashville, and the students' mouths would just drop open. And as my friend and colleague Sizway Herring always says, when you throw something away, there's no such place as away. The thermal plant and the Bordeaux landfill, that's away. There's actually a place that people live next to where your orange peels and milk cartons and anything else you discard go. And so when it's burned, now they had all this ash. When I first moved to Nashville, I would drive in along 65 north through North Nashville. And on either side of the highway, on the banks of the Cumberland River near Salem Town, well, with the old Salem Town, not what's over there now, we've gentrified, but the old Salem Town, which is like 95% Black, I thought, are these volcanoes? There would be these huge gray mountains that would smoke. It was the ash from the thermal plant right there in close to Buena Vista in Salem Town, smoking. Who knows how that smelled? It was an eyesore. And then at some point, Metro's government said, well, let's remediate the ash pile and bury them under some soil and plant grass on top. And it's still there. You can go see those mounds. Those are not natural hills. That's ash from thermal with grass planted. But in doing that, the plan was to go into Bordeaux and create an illegal soil mine to get the soil to cover up the ash. So this, I use the term negative externalities. I mean, this should be in the dictionary next to negative externalities, this meaning this thermal plant case. Well, what happened to the thermal plant? Well, for years, people like Bruce Wood and Byrne and others organized and fought to get it closed down. And maybe it was divine intervention. It burned down eventually. And then there was a long period of time where nothing was happening on that piece of property. And I'll talk about that later. But in the next decade came what's called the Brownfields program. This is essentially land recycling. So we have land that is essentially waste, specifically land that has hazardous waste. And a brownfield site is a piece of property that either has actual or perceived toxic contamination that prevents it from being developed. Why? Because toxic waste remediation is outrageously expensive. My first job out of college, out of Western Kentucky University, I was a hazardous materials specialist for the U.S. Department of the Interior. And so if a site like this Marathon Motor Works was suspected of being contaminated, and let's say someone wanted to clean up that site would fall under what we call the Superfund laws, or the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. Keyword liability. So if, let's say, some poor soul, or not even a poor soul, let's say a bank foreclosed on Marathon Motor Works, now the bank owns the building. Along comes the federal government and says, who owns this rotting, polluted site? Oh, it's this bank. Now, at that time, banks didn't deal with hazardous waste. They just wanted the property. Now, all of a sudden, this bank owns this contaminated site. And you might say, well, let's just clean the site up. Well, that might just cost you $100 million, $200 million, $300 million. That was the price tag of some of the cleanups that I worked with when I was working for the federal government. Very expensive. No developer would want to get hit with that price tag. Why so expensive? Because the Superfund law requires land to be cleaned up to what we call background levels. In other words, pristine. After this Marathon Motor Works was cleaned up, your baby should be able to crawl around there and put dirt all in his mouth and be fine. Okay. Very expensive to do that. And so all over the country, there were these mostly old factories, vestiges of the industrial revolution, which was shut down, closed down as manufacturing jobs, left this country during the 1970s and 1980s, and they were an eyesore and just unsafe for any community to deal with. The federal government made a compromise with the Brownfields program, said, okay, we will allow you to commit funds to clean up these sites. We will commit funds to these sites, but you don't have to clean them up to pristine levels. You can clean them up just enough so that you can call it the Marathon Music Works, which you see down there on the lower right-hand side of the screen. So when the Marathon Motor Works became the Marathon Music Works, and you can see it was part of the Nashville Brownfields redevelopment program that you see here on the left-hand side of the screen. So I want you to just keep your eye on where these parcels of land are as I get further into the presentation. These are the Brownfields redevelopment districts for Nashville. Just watch where, just remember that. I'm not going to come back to this slide, but just remember where those parcels of land are. Now, this is what the goal is in terms of brownfields reclamation or land recycling. So remember the Bordeaux landfill, it is now the Bordeaux landfill certified wildlife habitat center. I've been out there once. I don't know if there's really a buffalo. I guess that's a cow. So now that does not mean that this landfill is clean or that it's pristine. I mean, there was a period of time when the Cumberland River started to cut into the banks around Bordeaux, and a lot of that buried trash started to flow out into the Cumberland River. So this is a solution that's somewhat controversial because technically this entire unlined landfill should have been excavated with clean soil brought in. Clearly, that's not what happened here. It's all that trash is still there. They're still off-gassing methane, but it's better than having a stinky landfill, or so some would say. Probably not going to get any development out there, but at least it's a nice green space. And that thermal plant went from being the waste transfer facility site to the Ascend Amphitheater. Okay, so isn't this wonderful? No more smoky, nasty, disgusting thermal plant. Now we have the Ascend Amphitheater. Isn't that beautiful? But you better believe that once this amphitheater was constructed, the value of all the land around it shot up. And so this is what we call in some cases green gentrification. So where that Marathon Motor Works plant was, when that plant was a live brownfield site, it was in the within a stone's throw of the Jackson Courts and John Henry Hale housing community. Now that it's the Marathon Music Works, no longer a nasty brownfield site, the complexion literally of that community has changed. Jackson Courts is still there, but everything around it has changed. You have probably $300,000-$400,000 homes there. The John Henry Hale homes went through the Hope 6 program, which resulted in a lot of displacement again. So this was almost like the second coming of urban renewal, the Hope 6 program. Interestingly enough, Nashville was one of the most successful cities in terms of Hope 6. There were a lot of cities that got the Hope 6 dollars, which were used to tear down the old housing projects, which were centers of concentrated poverty, and replace them with a much more aesthetically pleasing environment. And so that was done with the Preston Taylor homes, John Henry Hale homes, and some other public housing projects around town. But the end result is the people who were living in that community in North Nashville off of Charlotte, and if are not able to enjoy that neighborhood, because literally you had what's called dream gentrification. I'd say probably 80 to 90% of the people in that community who were living there before were renters. If Mr. or Miss Developer came along and offered the person who was their landlord $2, $3, $4 million for the property, those renters had no rights. You had 30 days to get out. Well, at least that's what some of the landlords told the tenants. Really, they still had a right to stay through the end of their lease. But I've personally known people who were told 30 days. So it just changes the complexion of the community altogether. Good news, waste site gets cleaned up. Bad news, the people who are living next to the waste don't get to enjoy the new stuff. They are been removed. And so I'm just going to flash through a few more of these slides. It's just to let us know that there's not an end to this, that even though we've had the 1994 Environmental Justice Executive Order and EPA instituted the Office of Environmental Justice in the early 1990s. And then some of the states have had, there's still problems. And so in Bordeaux, the threats continue. This is a product called EJ Screen. So part of my background is in geographic information systems. EJ Screen is a geographic information systems platform that community people or community stakeholders can use to examine the threats in their communities on a quantitative basis. This is a very powerful tool if a community is trying to fight against the siting of a polluting facility or the permitting of a polluting facility by saying, so for instance, this red here is where you have a 98% cancer risk based upon the exposure that people in the communities have. And if you see that red square, that's KC Homes. That red dot, here's JC Napier showing up blood red, along with many other areas in North Nashville. Here's Bordeaux, red, right? So here's Salem Town. And so we can see that we're not out of the, well, we wish we were in the woods, but we're not out of the contaminated landscape altogether yet. There's still a lot of threats out there. Fortunately, we have council persons and I really implore upon my students, don't just vote when it's popular. So right now, everybody's voting. But the next time that there's a council district election, or there's a mayoral election, or who knows, local election, or congressional district election, people should vote just as enthusiastically as they are voting during a controversial presidential election as we're doing now. Because had it not been for several council persons, of course, Sharon Hurt, and of course, Erica Gilmore, and of course, Erica Gilmore's mother has been, Brenda Gilmore has been a long standing soldier in the environmental justice movement. Of course, Scott Davis. Very fortunate that we had council members that were able to stop a waste facility. So this was from 2018, waste facility still planned for Bordeaux, as if they hadn't had enough. Moving to another part of Bordeaux. So this is where I talked about urban mining. There's a mine in the middle of the city near Bordeaux. And so the mine was trying to extend its permit because it had literally run out of surface land to pull, I guess, limestone out of the ground. So the idea was, instead of disturbing the surface, let's extend the mine underground beneath these people's homes, along with blasting and everything else. Now, it sounds like a bad idea. It's really a bad idea. So there's where the Rogers Group mine, and you can see how close these communities are to that active mine or quarry. It's a mine. You can see how massive, So this is limestone. And we know that when limestone is subjected to blasting, that it's not very stable. Limestone it vibrates. It sometimes limestone flies for hundreds of feet away from the blasting area, and yet this project was planned to go underneath these folks' homes. So they got in touch with me at some point because of my background in geology and hydrogeology, in order to establish the argument that this just isn't a good idea. And so here's some geology. I'm not going to I said bore you, but you can see there are sinkholes. This is a relatively unstable area. And this is a graphic about sinkholes. So this is an area that is prone to sinkholes. So imagine that. What causes sinkholes a lot of times? When human beings disturb the subsurface. Someone's home could fall down into one of these sinkholes after a blast. And this happens in this area pretty frequently. This meaning homes being damaged by sinkholes and subsidence. Some of you probably remember the Corvette plant in Bowling Green. That's a perfect example of what happens when there's a sinkhole collapse. Fortunately, no one was injured in that situation. So this is 2019. The struggle still continues there in Bordeaux against this quarry. And so it just seems as if there's no relief in sight in terms of environmental injustice. And so we must continue to educate young people, educate people who might not necessarily consider themselves environmentalists. Say, look, educate our policymakers and local decision makers so that we won't put people's lives and properties ahead of the profits of business. So now I'm going to go into very quickly through three cases of solid waste, race, in Middle Tennessee, the green gentrification in the Edgehill community, and then our adventure with recycling at Tennessee State University, and then, if there's time, the environmental racism case in Dixon County, which is also in Middle Tennessee. Tennessee State University today has a recycling program and a metro recycling drop-off center. It took literally 11 years to make that happen. So these environmental justice struggles don't happen overnight, and they don't happen with just one person. All of these people, individuals and organizations and students were involved in making this happen. Well, what happened exactly? Well, in 2003, I wrote an article by Dr. Paul Mahai at the University of Michigan, and he was among several scholars who were doing research to dispel the myths that Black people don't care about the environment. I mean, that's the myth, that we don't like to camp, we don't like to be in the woods. We're going to go camping, we'll go glamping, but certainly not just roughing it. And we're not going to belong to the Sierra Club. We're not going to join. But Dr. Mahai's research and others showed that that's literally mythology. But I've noticed that in Dr. Mahai's research and other research, that this 20% gap in participation in recycling was pretty much the same across the board. And as a scientist, as a researcher, that's a question, that's a problem. Why is that? Why are we not recycling as Black people? So my thought was, okay, if we established a recycling center in Tennessee State University, so here, that T point symbol, that's where Tennessee State University is located in Nashville. That's where the campus is. The darker shaded area symbols, that's where African-American population is the highest. The lighter shades where African-American population is lower. And we don't need to do a heat map. If we just look at this map through casual observation, you can see that where these R's, where the metro recycling drop-off centers are, they're not near any Black people. And so I thought, aha, it's a conspiracy. The city doesn't want Black people to recycle. No wonder we don't participate, because it's a conspiracy. But of course, sometimes our first guess is wrong. And so the plan was, let's go about the business of getting a recycling center at Tennessee State University. I thought it was going to be easy. But of course, not everything is easy at all. So we started off, we did get some seed money from the National Wildlife Federation, the Tennessee Department of Environmental, to TDEC, donated some bins, and we started to go to work to try to establish a recycling program on Tennessee State University's campus, because we discovered that before we could go proselytizing to the community, the Black community, about participating in recycling, we had to start recycling at TSU. And at that time, we were not. And it's not that there was not an effort or that there was not caring. Simply, the simple fact is that a lot of things like waste disposal at public institutions are outsourced. So there's a contractual agreement, say, between a state institution and some private waste removal company that does not include recycling. And so if, say, Tennessee State University, Metro Schools, whomever, was to renew the contract and say, well, this year we want you to also recycle waste management along with getting rid of solid waste, that would not result in a lower bill. The bill would go up. So there was a cost involved that was a deterrent to recycling, and there was a human resource issue. And so we had to start recycling at TSU before we went around to the community. So this is an old map that I made. If some of you might, this is ArcView for some of you GIS heads out there. And so with ArcView, we still had this, so in many cases, 20% gap in recycling participation between Blacks and whites in Nashville. And so the thought was, let's get the recycling started at TSU, and then we're going to spread the gospel of recycling out in the Black community. And so students, we use GIS, we use to show where the most recycled material was produced on campus with the bins. Mr. Kesterson, George Kesterson, really helped us a lot in this effort, really was behind us all the way. So it took a few years, and then we finally got buy-in from the university. So you can see some familiar faces there. Sharon Smith, there's me, there's Sizway, Herring. And so we put together a committee that finally was going to create this community university recycling center, but we had to have buy-in from the university. There are almost no recycling programs that were started by the administration at colleges and universities. They were almost all started by students, or in some case, some combination of students and faculty, or some nonprofit entity and students. Even the famous recycling program at Middle Tennessee State University was started largely by students and faculty members. So we were on our way, but we had to do some convincing. The reason why there were no recycling centers in the Black communities is after you've had a landfill in your neighborhood, then a couple of waste treatment plants, then of course an ash pile, a soil mine, and I can go on and on. People get weary. People get very nervous. There's lack of trust. So from what I was told in these community informational meetings was that when the Metro government went to Bordeaux and other Black communities and said, hey, would you like a recycling center? Local government said recycling. Black people heard trash. No more. Yeah, right. Recycling. Yeah, sure. No, you need to get that recycling somewhere else outside of our community. And so we had to break that wall down. And it wasn't difficult. Once we put on that big blue tiger suit, or whatever you want to call it, we got the TSU tie here on. This Tennessee State University broke those, our representing the university and saying this is going to be a collective, not an imposition. The community was literally sold. A lot of these people, if they didn't actually go to Tennessee State University themselves, their children went or their parents went. There's probably like a 1 degree separation as far as Tennessee State University in Nashville and the Black community. So appropriately on April 22nd, 2008, on Earth Day, we finally established the Recycling Drop-Off Center at Tennessee State University. I hit a little bump in the road after 3 years. I came to campus one day and this is all I saw. We went from those big bins to that. But then I showed up on, but then that we still were able to get some changes on campus. We have a recycling program on campus still to this day that is operational, and it's paper and plastic, and a lot of the students are very aware of recycling and they want to do it. I mean, they don't have to be convinced. The only challenge with recycling is in the dorms. That's another research paper, master's thesis. And the students will recycle in the classroom buildings. They'll recycle in the student center. The dorms, very difficult. I don't understand it, but maybe that's a question for somebody to answer if someone hasn't already. Why won't these students recycle in their dorms? Anyway, a couple of years later, Recycling Center came back in 2014 and it's been there ever since. And I use this center all the time. And those bins are full, very full. I think there's 2 cardboard bins out there. People are using this facility very much, very proud of everything that was done. I would like to do some more research on what's happening with recycling in Nashville now, or perhaps if I can convince one of my undergraduate or graduate students to take that on, hopefully we will update some of this work that I did almost 20 years ago. Okay, now green gentrification. So I think I've already defined this term, so I'll just tell you what was going on. So in Edge Hill, the Edge Hill community, which is a gentrifying community in Nashville, but in the middle of that community, when it was a Black community, was a very large dry cleaning factory. This isn't where you drop off your clothes. This is where your clothes go after you drop them off in this massive facility. And they used a chemical called perchloroethylene. So it's not really dry cleaning. It's really chemical cleaning, but dry cleaning sounds a lot nicer. I used to wonder about that when I was a kid. Dry cleaning? How can it be dry? It's not dry. They use these very toxic chemicals. Now, this factory had been in this Edge Hill community for nearly 100 years. So it was literally grandfathered or grandmothered out of every zoning, environmental regulation in the city, and operated with impunity, dumping this waste in the middle of this Black community for decades. And then, of course, it closed down and turned into a brownfield site. The former owners of the site entered a state brownfields program specifically for dry cleaners, but he had the option, or he wanted the land to be redeveloped commercially instead of residential, instead of being residential zoning. At the time, there was no zoning. And so the community wanted this property zoned residential so that it would fit the single family house landscape in the area. The property owners knew that they could make more money with commercial development. The community feared that whatever was built there would be designed to fit the needs and wants of more recent arrivals, i.e. gentrifiers, than people who had been there for decades and generations. And so again, this was a compromise was made. The site was not cleaned up to pristine levels. It was essentially a brownfields program. And so instead of removing and excavating all of the tainted soil, the soil was left in place and treated with another chemical that supposedly would break down the toxins and make the land safe. That was the plan. This is called in situ remediation of toxic chemicals. And so, of course, the residents weren't really trusting anyone. They thought, really, how can you have a site contaminated for almost 100 years and you don't remove the contaminated soil and it's still safe? So here's some more geology. The limestone in this area, the limestone geology in this area makes it possible for contaminants to move very quickly, much more quickly than they would through any other part of many parts of the country. And also, if you notice in this area, you don't have to dig very far before you hit solid rock. There's a very thin soil cap here. And so therefore, contaminants can't get absorbed, and there's no soil for contaminants to be absorbed into. They go right into the substructure and into surface water and wherever. More geology. This is all geology, more geology. But essentially, that's what all those graphics explain, is how the contaminants can very quickly move through the substrate in this area. But health study was done by Metro Health, said that the area was safe. Obviously, residents still weren't convinced. And Metro said, well, it's okay to build the cleaners as long as the tainted soil. So notice it didn't say that the soil wasn't tainted. It says, let's just not disturb it. Really? I want to show you something. Here's, does that soil look undisturbed to you? What about that soil? Does that look like this site is undisturbed? How about that? Anything not, that look not? So, of course, at the end of the day, the fears of the community came to light. The Edge Hill Village, as you can see, has, the first sign, the dog whistle of gentrification, the coffee shop, where you can get a cup of coffee for as much as it would cost you to buy a whole bag of beans. I think another place that was a place where you can't get a massage, but if your dog needed a massage, you could go get a massage. And then there was another restaurant there that's very pricey. And what made matters worse is there have been cases I've heard where young African-American men walking home from school past this Edge Hill Village have had the police called on them because they look suspicious in their own neighborhood. This is exactly why the community did not want something like this. But this is a clear case of green gentrification. You had a nasty, disgusting, contaminated dry cleaning site turned into something that is not befitting the indigenous people in this community. By indigenous, I mean African Americans in this case, but leaning more towards the gentrifying population that's coming in and displacing African Americans at a rapid rate all throughout this community. Speaking of gentrification, notice that the same areas where we had the Nashville Brownsfield, I told you to keep an eye on that map. Here's the most rapidly gentrifying tracts, and also where we saw the Brownfields program implemented. So green gentrification shown clearly on this map. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through this last case. This is the Dickson County landfill case. The unfortunate victims of this case was Sheila Holt Orsted and other African Americans in Dickson County. In a nutshell, toxins from an unlined landfill were discovered in people's private wells in Dickson County. Soon afterwards, the white families or white community was pulled off of the wells and added to city water. The African American community was allowed to drink this contaminated water for another 9 years. Many of the people that you see in this picture either had cancer, and the patriarch of the Holt family here passed away during this case. That's Sheila Holt Orsted's father. And so this was a fight that eventually involved the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard. I was the one who invited him to get involved. I wasn't sure he was. I mean, remember, he's the father of environmental justice. I was sure he was quite busy. He showed up, and he and Dr. Beverly Wright showed up, and he said, this is the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard. He said that this Dickson County case was the worst case of environmental racism he had ever seen. That's the father of environmental justice. So right here in Middle Tennessee, we had the worst case of environmental racism that the father of environmental justice had ever seen. Eventually, the case was settled. They were able to get legal representation from the Natural Resources Defense Council. And so here's some more geology and some more. There's a map of the city of Dixon and the landfill and topographic map and more geology. And then here is a picture taken from the Hope family's front yard, and there's a landfill right there. So they lived literally next door to this facility. And then this is another picture taken from the front yard of the Hope family, and there's a landfill literally right next door. And just showing you, just how serious that case was. But there's been some relief, but some of the damage cannot be undone. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I guess we have a few minutes for questions. I tried to keep it right at an hour and like a few minutes for Q&A. Oh, yeah, Shelby, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Okay. I was saying, Dr. Padgett, thank you so much for your presentation here. And I will stop the screen share, or you can.
I have to stop it. Yeah.
Okay, so we can just see our faces here. People can chat. Yeah, so please, in the audience, if you have questions, share them. And I have some things written down here that I, can ask you, Dr. Padgett, for now. So a question I have, because I want to make sure that it's not lost. Earlier, when you were talking about landfills and siting and predictor variables, can you just reiterate for folks that might not be aware of like how the modeling works? Like, what does that mean, the predictor variable, and how race is like the most significant or powerful predictor of siting of some of these features on a landscape that are usually unwanted?
Yeah, well, I guess I can say there's a lot of math involved. Probably the best person to consult would be some of Dr. Robert Bullard's work, and I guess for the toxic race and waste study, there was the first toxic race and waste study by the United Church of Christ in 1987. I think it was in 20 years later, I think there was an update. So the first version was actually the person who did a lot of work on it was Vernice Miller Travis, who was a co-founder of We Act for environmental justice in Harlem. And so she did a lot of that work the first time around. And then in the United Church of Christ updated it with more sophisticated geographic information systems technology 20 years later, and got the same results. So those are just a couple of the, easy to access sources that show that race is the primary driving factor in environmental injustice.
Hey, Dr. Padgett, I want to say thank you for the eye-opening presentation. And I learned a lot, and it's great because I've lived in Nashville 20 years to see what was here before. I heard about the thermal, and I was here when that burned down. How ironic, right? But we want to move forward, right, from here, where we are now. And you had 3 research topics that you identified that are things that could be possible research projects moving forward for GIS mapping of comparisons. But what would you recommend? What would be your top 3 things you would like to see our community embrace or work on to make this a more equitable experience with regard to recycling and trash?
Yes, so as you know, I'm participating with several organizations on solid waste in Nashville at this time. And, I guess getting to zero waste, what would it take for us to get to zero waste and get out of this mindset, and it's really it goes just beyond environmental issues. It's psychological, it's economic. So from a psychological standpoint, there are some societies on this planet where there is no word for waste in their language. No word. They don't have a word for waste. How many words do we have for waste? Let's see: waste, refuse, trash, garbage, disposable. I mean, it's just part of our culture. Whereas in other places, they don't have a word for waste. And so can we get there? I don't know about that, but just eye opening. I saw a documentary about um, clothing, and I always thought, I have some. Don't judge me. I have some shirts that are 24 and 25 years old. Okay, don't judge me. I have a pair of shoes that I bought in 1990. Still wearing them, right? And I thought, wow, when I buy a shirt now, it doesn't last like that. And I thought, well, maybe, I don't know. But it turns out that it's on purpose. Clothes now are made to be disposable on purpose. And so this documentary, I can't remember the name of it. Um, it said that essentially it used to be that clothes were made for seasons. They said now clothes designed for weeks. What color are you wearing this week? What color are you wearing next week? And so it's what makes it even worse is that even if a um, good thinking, or a good minded or well thinking person decides I'm going to donate my old clothes to Goodwill or to um, the Salvation Army or what have you, the clothes today are of such poor quality that they're just trash. They can't be. So now there's a whole business of exporting these clothes to India, parts of Africa, and there are literally mountains of clothes discarded from this country um, in other parts of the world, and they're not wearable, and they're rotting and stinking in somebody else's community. And I'm thinking, it's. I mean, I thought I was imagining things. I mean, it was, and so to purposefully design something so that it won't last, to me, should be criminal. I mean, this is just creating trash and waste on purpose when clearly it's not necessary. Like I said, 30 years ago, when I bought some of my shirts that I still wear, I'm sure that the textile or clothing manufacturing industry was a lot less technologically efficient than it is now. You would think that now you could design clothes that could last a little while longer than a couple of months. But it's just it's just a sea change in attitudes that we have to deal with. And I saw another documentary or read some stories about the myth of plastic recycling that just messed me all up. I thought, wow, I'm recycling this plastic, and then the reality is, big oil is doing everything they can to undercut plastics recycling. So they actually sell this false narrative of recycling through advertising, which is just an out and out lie. It's just so. I mean, we're fighting against things that in this so-called capitalist system that are very difficult to um, fight against. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't have this. I don't have the human solution. Uh, but as I mean, I know Garrett Hardin. Everybody has an opinion about Garrett Hardin, but in his famous essay, "The Tragedy of the Commons," he said, "There's no technical solution to this problem. There's no technology that we're going to create that's going to make this waste problem go away. It's something deeper. Can we change it? I don't know, but that's the task." And I'm faced with and working with people in the community who are trying to get us to zero waste.
So, Dr. Padgett, we have a comment in the chat. And so this participant says, thank you for your fantastic presentation. This individual is a faculty member in the political science department at MTSU, and she wants to get in contact with you and follow up. And so this is something that I usually end with, but since we're on this comment right now, for those that do want to get in contact with you to follow up, how can they reach you, Dr. Padgett?
I'll just put my information in the chat, my email address, and I've been right here since March. I'm not going anywhere. So
Okay.
reach out. I'll be right here in my loft.
March, what year though, right? I mean, you've been here doing this work for obviously a little bit longer than since March.
Oh no, I mean I've been in my loft since March. I mean, normally I'd be on campus, I'd be on flying somewhere, I'd be not in Nashville, but I've been right here since March. I did go to the March on Washington in August. That was it. Otherwise, I've been right here. So I'm available.
Okay, very good.
And I do want to say thank you for the work you have done to get that recycling operation going on at TSU in the heart of your community. And I do visit those convenience centers as well, the one on Trinity Lane, when I drop off my glass in particular. Everything else I put in my curbside cart. But I do believe in Tennessee Environmental Council. I mean, our mission is to improve the environment. And so we work from the belief that we can change these practices that have caused so much harm for people and the environment. And that's our work. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue and working with you, Dr. Padgett, and figuring out how we can put some of these solutions in place for everybody.
Thank you. It's been, yes, I still have lots of work to do, but there's always hope, you know, always. Yeah. Whoever, I thought that I would, when I first moved to Tennessee and I went to a restaurant, the non-smoking section was in the back of the restaurant and the smoking section was in the front, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, you would have to hide to get to the I never thought I would see the day in Tennessee when we would have, you know, no smoking, I just can't believe, I still am like, really?
I know, it was banned in all facilities. Just getting it banned in the state legislature was a huge accomplishment, right?
Yeah, I thought there's no way. I mean, it was done. I mean, there was no wide protest. I mean, and then, you know, and especially with the, you know, tobacco industry being so big here and in this region, I'm amazed at what happened. So if that can happen, anything can happen.
Exactly. And it can happen once, I mean, well, a little bit flip side analogy, but even alcohol sales in grocery stores on Sundays, it seemed like that would never happen in Tennessee. Lo and behold, it happened in Tennessee, and now it's commonplace, right? So it can happen really quickly once the leadership decides that it's time to recycle. It's time to stop depending on landfills to bury our trash. Meanwhile, the trash has high value if it can be recycled and turned into new materials. So there's hope, absolutely.
So Dr. Padgett, I have another question here. So it relates back to something you said earlier in the presentation about asthma and how that's a part of a health impact with land use. And then you also mentioned how that's related to academic performance. So that means we're talking about something that some folks may see as an environmental issue, but then also a health issue, but then also an educational issue. So I guess, how do you, think about like how these issues all come together and how some people, you know, still see them as distinct? And do you have any tips for people that are in the environmental space to, you know, help people to think about things in a more intersectional fashion?
Yeah, like I said, this is a holistic This is a holistic journey that we're on, or venture. I have taught classes like environment and society, and the students who are chemistry majors and and biology majors, they didn't want to hear anything about policy. They didn't want to hear anything about that or the law, the legal side. And then those students who were in the humanities and who were more policy oriented, they didn't want to hear anything about the physical processes. But you know, you have to at least have some rudimentary understanding of the science if you're not a scientist, and you have to have some rudimentary understanding of the policy if you're not in policy or even dealing with human beings. And I could tell a lot of stories of physical scientists who are doing all kinds of research without any consideration of how it's going to impact the human environment. And then I've talked to people who can pontificate to you all day long about Kyoto and Copenhagen. And then you ask them, well, gee, how does the atmosphere warm up? And they can't answer that question, you know? So, and the second thing is this is a team endeavor. I mean, and especially I implore upon people who are on the more technical side, because really the social science side and the theological side and the policy side of the environmental justice movement is very well staffed. Dr. Bullard is a sociologist, Dr. Mahai is a sociologist, Dr. Wright is a sociologist, and you got Monique Hardin, who's an attorney, Reverend Benjamin Chavis. Now his undergraduate degree is in chemistry, but he's a theologian. But 85% of Superfund sites have groundwater and soil contamination. And so in that case, in Edge Hill, we could have all of the policymakers, attorneys in the world, but if you don't understand that groundwater contamination science and what perchloroethylene does physically, as Dr. Robert Wingfield from Fisk University joined me in that fight, you're not going to win. And it's challenging to get physical scientists to become involved, because that's just not the nature of that discipline. You deal with rocks, not humans. You're out in some playa valley somewhere in Nevada looking at stratigraphy. You know, it's not where you don't have the human interface. So it's a team effort because it's a holistic struggle. It's a holistic struggle. I was teaching a class and I was telling these students, well, you have to know the National Environmental Policy Act backwards and forwards. And they would, no, we don't want to do that. You know, that's too, we're not going to do any policy. You know, we don't want to do that. And like and it's funny, the students who had never had internships, they were the ones that didn't want to learn anything about NEPA. The students who had actually left campus and done internships knew NEPA backwards and forwards, Section 101, Section 404, they could quote it to you. And so, you know, we can't hide from any aspect of knowledge in this fight, even history. I mean, a lot of what I talked about today was history. You know, why are you talking about the urban renewal? Well, a lot of what you see happening right now is because of that, you know, 70 some years ago. And so,
yeah, and I was amazed to see how many Superfund sites were in the downtown area. That's mind blowing. In that downtown Nashville, where the skyscrapers are now being built.
Yeah, I mean that, and understanding that Superfund. I mean, I went to law school classes, and it's a very interesting law. I mean, it's one of the few laws that has joint and several liability, right? Either one person can be guilty or everybody can be guilty. You've got retroactive liability. So it doesn't matter when the contamination happened, historically. Right. Doesn't matter. You can go, I've seen cases where the EPA went after people whose grandfathers or great grandfathers had like gold mines, like mining claims in the 1800s. As potentially responsible parties. The most infamous case of that is the Peak Oil case in Tampa, Florida. If you really want to see how extensive that law is, the Peak Oil case was where it was a facility where good-minded people would take their waste oil. You change oil in your car and you go to Peak Oil and you turn it in and you get $1 or whatever. I did my duty. I took my oil. They were dumping oil in the backyard
Oh no.
for years. So they got caught, turned into a Superfund site. Peak Oil turned around. They kept very meticulous records. They sued every single person individually who ever dropped off oil at that site. And when the EPA broke down the bill, each one of those individuals was liable for about $1,200. I mean, so you have to understand, the legal aspects, physical aspects, but it's best to have a team. It's best to have a team and not leave anybody out, because everybody can contribute. Just very quickly, speaking of which, one of the good things that's happening now, now I'm a cusper. I'm the last of the baby boom. I'm kind of right on that cusp between Gen X and the boomers. So the baby boomers are retiring, but thanks to advances in medicine, they're very healthy. They're not retiring, and they want to get involved. They're one of the most educated generations we have. They're joining churches, they're joining nonprofits, they're doing this and that. But unfortunately, these boomers, when they get so involved in our nonprofit organizations, that they suck all the air out of the room. And you have young people who want to contribute, and they're just sitting there like, what can I do? Put your hand down. You whippersnapper, right? But when I work in communities and we bring EJ Screen and GIS and we have to make maps, 60-year-old boomers, they this is the generation that has electric typewriters. I remember when PCs came into existence. I remember those old electric typewriters and the big ledgers, no spreadsheet, these big ledgers. And so trying to get some people from that generation to use the technology that we need in this fight is impossible. But I always tell them, do you have a nephew or a niece that's kind of good at computers? And it really changed the dynamic, because the young people have no problem figuring out the technology, but the young people lack the context. But they can sit down with their grandmother, and grandma can tell them about what happened when Interstate 40 came through, and she can tell them about urban renewal, right? And so when you bring the generations together, then you have a very powerful organization or tool or group in this fight. And so I really like the way that young people get involved now.
And Dr. Padgett, thank you for that. And I want to be respectful of people's time, because we have about 5 minutes left for the schedule, and we have a question and comment coming out of the Q&A. So this guest is saying that they are working on revamping a recycling program within their organization, and they are trying to find a waste management service. They're trying to find the right vendor. And so the question here is, do you have any suggestions of third-party waste management vendors that that operate equitably and ethically? And we haven't found very many in the Nashville area. So can you speak to that, Dr. Padgett?
I know that I don't know, everybody has their opinion. We used to work with Earth Savers. They were okay with us. Everybody has an opinion about Earth Savers. But other than that, I mean, I really haven't been on the ground with that. I'm sure that there are all kinds of organizations that are out there. Perhaps contact the Urban Green Lab. They might be able to put you in contact with some people that are working on the ground with recycling.
Great.
Hey, I do want to say before we conclude, Shelby, that I will credit my professors at UCLA in the early 1990s. I was a geography major and environmental studies, and it was my professors that opened my mind and my eyes to the bigger picture of the environment and how humans are the cause of all those environmental problems out there in our communities, and that we are the solutions. And so thank you, Dr. Padgett, because it was folks like you that got me into this career path, and I'm forever grateful of that. And I'm inspired by what we had to say tonight.
Yeah, well, I knew there was something I liked about you, but you and your sister, I cannot remember the film you guys made.
Jennifer was my sister. Yeah, and we had a striking resemblance. So.
Yeah, but what was the film? I can't,
Kilowatt. She did kilowatt. Well, we did kilowatt hours.
Kilowatt hours. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That I showed that in I showed that in my class to this day.
That's awesome.
This day, it is just such a comprehensive. I mean, it's timeless. Even though it was made a while ago, it really brings to light. It ties everything together from the physical to the health and just why we should be concerned. So, yeah. I use that film in class to this day.
That's great, and that means the world to me to hear that. And we, my wife and I, well, she was in the film as well. We were living in Bordeaux while we were producing that film, and a lot of the scenes took place right there in that community. So that was my home for 4 years when I first moved to Nashville. But it was amazing to see that story made such an impact in the clean energy arena, and hoping to do the same here with Tennessee Environmental Council in all arenas for solid waste and recycling, for trees and natural climate solutions, for pollinators and restoring. And these are things that people can do right now at their homes, no matter where you live, right? Whether you live in the inner city or the suburbs or in the rural parts of Tennessee, the solutions are at hand. And so we ask everybody to be the solution, find out what you can do right now.
Right. So thank you for sharing that, Jeff. And we are getting close to the top of the hour. And I have one burning question, and I know that you probably could have a lot to say about this. So I'll, hold you for just a few moments to maybe give us your short and sweet version of this, Dr. Padgett. But I guess one thing that struck me in the presentation, it was very clear to see how land was racialized. And so, seeing how like violence and segregation of Black people was transposed to the violence on the land when the land was racialized as Black. And so I guess I really want to hear your thoughts about, say, the importance or the connection between, or the implications of racial politics and racial equality and how it deals with our view of the environment and the land, and why, if we have some gains on that front, how it could change changes in the environmental movement. So can you, I guess, share your thoughts about that very, briefly?
Yeah, probably the best advice I could give is there's a series of films by the California Newsreel. One of them is called The House We Live In, and it really breaks down, how the redlining and the impact that it had. It's California Newsreel, The House We Live In. And then there's another film called The End of Suburbia. I think it's on YouTube. I think they both might be on YouTube somewhere. The End of Suburbia. Now, the End of Suburbia is really interesting in terms of what happened to land in cities and urban areas in this country, but it leaves out what is in The House We Live In, which is the racial component. But if you put those two together back to back, you'll get a full dose of what happened. And it's really, it almost makes you angry, almost as angry as I got when I learned what's happening with clothing now. Like, really, what? So I mean, they say the love of money is the root of all evil. I mean, it's just it just boggles the mind. Yeah. So those two documentaries.
Okay, excellent. Well, with that, thank you so much, Dr. Padgett, for your presentation and for staying for Q&A. And I know that the audience here has been enriched by your perspectives, as Jeff said, and as I'm saying now. And so on behalf of the Tennessee Environmental Council, we thank you so much. And we also thank you to all the participants that have joined us here live, and then also for those that are watching this recording. And so with that, the Tennessee Environmental Council strives to connect people with the natural world. And we have these conversations here in our policy and practice space to inform people. And so we can be more aware and active participants in what we do here in Tennessee. So with that, good night, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay,
Bye.
good night. Be safe.